Really delighted everyone could join us today. It's a tough field in terms of competition, so really thrilled that we've chosen this session. My name's Will, and with my colleague Izzy Zawartka, we're going to be talking a bit about some research that we've done into international work experience practices. This work was commissioned by the Charity Speakers for Schools, for whom Elnaz Kashaf-Patel works, and it's brilliant that she is here and speaking immediately after us this morning. Dong-Wook, if we could move to the next slide, please. I'll talk very briefly about the scope of the commission that we've undertaken. It was designed to investigate these three research questions. Work experience specifically because other terms such as internships and work placements have quite a specific meaning and can mean something slightly different. Typically, internships we associate with paid placements, whereas work experience generally we tend to associate both with slightly younger students and with unpaid placements. The age range of 11 to 16 is because in the English context, in English schools, this is the secondary school age. So we have primary schools up to age 11, and then post-16 education where students undertake their A-levels is sort of a slightly separate part of our school system. So 11 to 16 is the secondary age group, broadly equivalent to high school in other countries. And we're talking from the lens of the English system rather than the UK system. So education is devolved in the UK. England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales have their own devolved education systems. So I'm talking about England specifically for that reason. Finally, the work that we undertook took place between August and November 2022. That was when we conducted our review. So some of what Petra has discussed and some of what Elnaz may discuss actually may be slightly more current than what we looked at, which is now about 6 months old. So it's just worth saying that. Dong-Wook, if we could just move on to the next slide. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Izzy, who will say more about our approach and then our findings.
Right, so good morning, everybody. Our method for this rapid evidence review is summarized in the graphic on this slide. So I won't spend too much time on this, but essentially we developed a protocol with our search parameters to send to our search partners Curie, which yielded 527 documents for our title sift, which then yielded 100 documents for an abstract sift, and finally that produced 31 documents for our full text review. So it's also important to note that searches were conducted in English for English language literature, and we used some gray literature to understand international work experience contexts. So we acknowledge that there will be some people on the call from some of the countries that we mentioned who will have a bit more knowledge about their country's practices. So if there are any updates or clarifications at the end of the presentation, we would really appreciate hearing these. So Donald, could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Right. So with the background, we'll move on into our findings. So I'll start with international practices. So from the international literature, we found that work experience is commonly characterized as a placement that is on an employer's premises, 1 to 2 weeks in duration, undertaken by a young person while still in full-time education, and carried out with the aim of exploring the suitability of a potential career and gaining exposure to the world of work. So these, as well mentioned, are different than internships, which tend to be either paid or longer, as well as vocational training and apprenticeships. So I'll give an overview of evidence for work experience fitting this general description in 5 high-income countries, and these are Australia, Canada, but specifically British Columbia, Finland, France, and Norway. So from these 5 for these 5 countries, Australia has a model most similar to the UK. Schools decide whether they want to provide work experience, and if so, how they would like to organize it. In British Columbia, work experience is part of courses called WEX 12A and 12B that students can elect to take when they are slightly older, 15 to 17. So the courses involve in-school instruction in addition to at least 30 hours spent on a placement. So Petra just spoke about work experience in the Nordic countries, and we have Finland and Norway listed here. We found that in these countries, work experience is mandatory and part of broader careers education courses called TET in Finland and Utdanningsvalg in Norway, which is probably not how you say that. And finally, in France, there is a 1-week mandatory work experience placement called Le Stage de Troisième that isn't tied specifically to a course. And the UK home nations all offer work experience similar to that in England, but notably in Northern Ireland, there is a centralized Connect NI platform where students can search for placement opportunities. Can we have the next slide, please? So the international literature outlined many enablers and challenges for effective work experience. The enablers fell under 3 main categories. So first we have preparation, support, and reflection. Our review uncovered the importance of clearly establishing and communicating the focus of work experience placements to both students and employers, as well as preparing students for their placement, providing adequate support to students during the placement, and offering post-work experience reflection. The second category of enablers is placement choice and design. We found that it's very important to offer placements in areas that students are interested in, rather than placements for placement's sake, which risk disengaging young people from the world of work. Also, we found that students enjoy well-designed placements where they have responsibility. In fact, in one study, interactive placements that allow sampling of different parts of a profession were seen to positively influence students' decisions to pursue work in that sector. So finally, we have staffing and networks. Having a staff member dedicated to the oversight of work experience in schools was described in the literature as a key feature of effective delivery, and strong relationships between schools and local employers were seen as key to sustaining a strong work experience offer long-term. Parent support was also mentioned, mainly around securing work experience placements and preparing students for them, which is especially key for students with special needs. The challenges to effective work experience also fall into 3 main categories. So the first was broadly concerns. For students, these are fear of the unknown and not feeling ready for their placements. For schools, there can sometimes be a focus on exam grades, which makes work experience seem like a disruption. Additionally, the literature mentioned that schools can see work experience as a luxury, which they don't actually have the capacity to organize. In the literature, there was also evidence of employer concerns that work experience was too burdensome, especially due to quote-unquote bureaucracy and paperwork. As a result of this, some employers might fail to see the business case of working with schools and fear that students' age and maturity level may prevent them from bringing in anything meaningful. The second area of challenges surrounds placement availability. Given a limited number of employers offering placements, schools may have to compete with one another and are also constrained to what is locally available. Availability was also found to be patterned by industry, which can make it harder for schools to provide opportunities covering a broad array of interests. Finally, when students have to secure their own placement, they most often draw on the social networks of their parents, which can lead to class patterns in the placements that students can secure. So finally, logistics are often an issue. Schools in rural areas especially have a more limited number of placements and potentially more difficulty related to transport. Timing is also difficult in that employers might not always be able to provide work experience right when schools want it. And lastly, work experience is external and hence involves more actors to coordinate than in-house careers education, which can lead to a greater administrative burden on schools. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So now moving on to impact, we looked at 3 different areas, specifically short-term, long-term, and impacts for specific groups. So in terms of short-term impacts, these were demonstrated in the literature mainly through survey research, and they included agreement among students and teachers that work experience gives a useful insight into the world of work, can improve employability skills such as communication and interpersonal skills, teamworking and self-management, and also that they can increase young people's confidence both in personal capabilities and future employability. Studies also demonstrated that work experience can improve attitudes towards school and increase motivation to do well in coursework and exams, although one study did show that disliking work experience can be associated with demotivation. Work experience was also shown to impact careers awareness, both by enhancing understanding of industries that students were previously aware of, as well as giving insight into new industries that they didn't know about before. And work experience was also found to have the potential to raise career aspirations. So these last two impacts are especially important in the context of literature on the danger of uncertainty and unrealism around careers, which is linked to an increased likelihood of becoming what is known as NEET, so not in education, employment, or training, as a young adult. So moving into longer term impacts, the literature offers more inconclusive evidence. In the area of education, the evidence on the actual impact rather than perceived impact of work experience on students' academic attainment is inconclusive. There is, however, some evidence to suggest that work experience can have a positive impact on students' progression into higher education as they make the decision to go to university, select a degree program, and navigate the admissions process. Regarding employment, there is evidence that young adults felt that placements were useful in getting a job after completing education, sometimes with the same firm as they completed work experience with. But evidence reviews that we read highlighted that there is a lack of studies robustly measuring the impacts of work experience on young people's employment prospects. Similarly, although engagement with employers generally is demonstrated to have a positive effect on pay in later life, there's less evidence for this for short work experience placements specifically. And on a more positive note, work experience is shown by 2 studies to be associated with a lower likelihood of becoming NEET in one's early 20s. And finally, we want to highlight that in terms of personal impacts, one longitudinal analysis showed how work experience participation was associated with higher life satisfaction at 26. So on to outcomes for specific groups. We found inconclusive evidence for the impact of work experience on young people most at risk of becoming NEET, and mixed outcomes for young people with low levels of attainment. Although the literature suggested that girls specifically stand to benefit from participating in work experience in terms of labor market outcomes, there is concerns that girls might pick opportunities which reinforce gender stereotypical trajectories, such as placements in health and beauty as compared to engineering, construction, and IT for their male counterparts. One study found positive impacts for students with autism spectrum disorder specifically in terms of improvement in communication and social interaction. And lastly, something which came up quite a lot in the literature was the experience of disadvantaged students. So while in theory, these young people stand to benefit more from work experience, there's evidence to suggest that non-disadvantaged peers benefit more. As an example, independent school students were shown by one study to perceive a higher value of their placements than non-selective state school peers, and independent school students were most likely to agree that their placement was of value to their university admission. Can we have the next slide, please, John? Thank you. So we have a few reflections on the approach and process of this review. The first is that there is a challenge to interpreting the evidence base that we reviewed, especially in terms of impacts that work experience delivers. Specifically, many studies looked at work experience alongside other career education interventions, which makes it hard to isolate the impact of short-term placements. Additionally, most studies offer correlational rather than causal evidence, so we cannot draw conclusions with full confidence. As a result of this, we feel that more high-quality evidence should be produced into the impacts of work experience placement, especially longer term, and we welcome the work of Petra and Elnaz on the call today, which does fulfill part of this recommendation. We also fear that there could be more research undertaken into delivery models adopted internationally and the effectiveness of these different approaches, looking at differences in experiences and benefits for students of different ages, and finally, how the pandemic shaped work experience and whether hybrid or online options can be adopted at a wider scale. Can we have the next slide, please, Jean-Luc? Thank you. So based on our rapid evidence review, we've come up with a series of recommendations for different work experience stakeholders. In the report, we have outlined 18, but I've chosen here to highlight just 5. So first, before placements, schools should help students to prepare for their placements, for example, in identifying what they want to learn while there, what to wear, and how to behave. To support employers, schools should provide verbal and/or written briefings to ensure that they understand the features of high-quality work experience so that placements are interactive, engaging, and varied. After placements, schools should facilitate feedback sessions and reflection, drawing out what students have learned while on their placement, how this links to their learning, and how learning affects their views about the future. So employers should also provide placements that are interactive, engaging, and provide opportunities to sample different parts of a particular profession. And finally, third sector organizations should help to broker opportunities between employers and schools. So that is it from me. I'll pass it back to Will for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Izzy. So a couple of final thoughts from me. Three challenges, actually, that I perceive relating to, firstly, the wider context of careers education in the English education system, which I would summarize as passionate but patchy. Careers education, as Izzy has described, can be something of a lottery, depending on where students are in the country and the sort of school that they attend. And it also hinges on who you know. So in that context, I think work experience faces some challenges. Secondly, I think there are actually some philosophical challenges. One of these is around what we perceive as the desired outcomes from work experience. So Alnaz's presentation to follow is very apt. Do we perceive work experience to be about hypothesis testing, and is it legitimate for work experience to rule options in but also rule them out? Are we willing to accept that a really useful function of work experience might be that students don't enjoy a placement and therefore decide that a career pathway is not for them? So I think that's an interesting question. Finally, I think there is a policy challenge. So that is how best to support work experience, either directly through policy that addresses it or indirectly through policy elsewhere in the education system. One question here is whether work experience should be mandated, and Petra's talked a little bit about that. I think there's another question about the extent to which work experience and careers education more broadly should be a direct feature of the curriculum. It is very minimally featured in the national curriculum that we have in England. Finally, work experience butts up against wider systemic barriers. So we know, certainly in the English context, and I know that this holds true in other international contexts, your background, so your class, your ethnicity, your sex, gender, etc., has a profound effect, or it can have a profound effect on the outcomes that you, on average, are likely to attain through education. So work experience operates alongside that context, and it's important, I think, to acknowledge that. Closing thoughts. I've been very fortunate to visit several other OECD countries and visit schools in those countries. One of those is Japan. One of those is Canada. I've visited schools in British Columbia. And my sense is that in those systems, they are grappling actually with some really fundamentally some of the same questions that we grapple with here in England, which is what's the right balance between so-called academic knowledge and lifelong skills. I'm not sure that that's something any system has cracked. I suspect that that is an eternal question that every education system faces. But it's worth acknowledging that other systems are grappling with similar issues. Those two countries actually highlight two different approaches to this. So in Japan, there's been some school-led innovation to introduce a greater emphasis on skills in students' learning. And in British Columbia, there's been an extensive process of curriculum and assessment reform over the last 5 or so years, which has very closely involved schools, but it's been centrally led by the Department for Education in British Columbia. So two different models for reform relating to skills and work experience by extension. We'll stop there, Anthony. So thank you all very much indeed for listening.